What's up, my miners of intelligence and consciousness? I'm Rick Brooks, and this is Rick's Mind. Today with me, I have guest Ford Fischer, who is an independent journalist. What's up, brother? Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Dude, it's a pleasure, man. I really like your work, and I think people like you, independent journalists, are very, very important in these kind of crazy times. And I think the best way, as always, to start an interview or a podcast is like, let the listeners know who you are. So like, how did you get into this, and kind of walk us through the things that you've covered?
Yeah, so News to Share is basically a platform for primary source documentary video, and I can define that term in a bit, but of political activism for the most part here in the United States. And so I co-founded it while I was in college with another then student named Trey Yingst, who is now an international reporter. He's currently reporting in Ukraine. But so since graduating college, it's been my full-time job, basically running this company where myself and freelancers for me do raw video documentation of political activism, both for consumers online to watch and be able to have kind of a bias-free, just raw video of what's going on presentation, as well as to be able to take that footage and get it used in network news as well as documentaries. And so the sort of vision is that you may remember from, everybody learns in grade school about the difference between primary sources and secondary sources. And sort of my criticism of the way that media has generally gone is that things have pushed toward a lot more kind of commentary-driven journalism, where, you watch CNN or something like that, and when a given story occurs, you have some commentator on the left and some commentator on the right, or whatever. Basically, people opining about the meaning of the news that they are telling you. And so the news media presents to you sort of how to think, or these are the kind of range of opinions about something, and that's framed as journalism. And that can be interesting, but it is what I would call secondary source journalism. And I think that for the purposes of educating audiences about what's actually happening, for the most part, it is more valuable when you can make the primary sources available. So in the case of something like a document, a memo, a change in law or something, having the original document be accessible to your audience is valuable, right? What does the actual text of the law say? Whatever. That's a primary source. When we're reporting on a speech, that some politician is given, a secondary source documentation is someone talking about the meaning of the speech, whereas a primary source documentation is here's video of the speech. And so I try to do this for political activism, where I am not someone who is going on YouTube and telling you what to think about a political protest, whether they're right or wrong or whatever. The idea is that left, right, outside of that spectrum, whatever, that I have my contributors and myself film those things and just put out raw footage absent any kind of commentary. And it's not just that it's supposed to exist in a vacuum, that its purpose is only to be just that, but that from there you can get those sorts of secondary source analysis. People can analyze that. People can find what the truth means to them, but they have to start at truth in the first place.
Yeah, 100%, man. That is very important. You're showing people the raw data of what's actually happening, and in real time, right? And then you put it out there, and you can make the decision yourself. You can see what side's right. Where have you done this? Like, what kind of stories have you told? I mean, I know, but I kind of want the listeners to know, like, kind of some of the things that you've shot and put out there.
For sure. So when I was sort of starting this off, again, with a friend from college at the time, we primarily were focused on the types of political activism that was happening then. And this was 2014, 2015. So pre-Trump. Trump is not a political phenomenon yet. Trump is still kind of a humorous theory about what if that guy ran for president, like he keeps, joking that he will. Yeah. And the activism during that period of toward the end of the Obama administration was largely people sort of flanking Obama from his left. And so we had a lot of activism that we filmed that was anti-war. from a leftist perspective. Anti-torture, for example, protests against Guantanamo Bay, as well as against his deportations. Right, there was a lot of interest again among what I would call like principled progressives, right? People who are critical of Obama, even though he has a D next to his name. So we had a lot of that kind of demonstration, filming people basically criticizing, but still doing activism. And at that point, the political right had not really learned street activism yet. So that will come a little bit later, but a big sort of breakthrough time period then was that there were the protests in Ferguson and Baltimore following the police killings of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. And so those were both situations that myself and the co-founder covered by, again, going out to those situations and basically just filming what was happening and the way that the police were responding to them. And sort of as an example of the way that that kind of footage is used, my footage from Baltimore, in addition to being used in documentaries, was actually used in We Own This City, which is an HBO show that had its premiere 2 nights ago. Three shots of ours are actually in the intro title sequence of that. So they'll play all 6 episodes. And that was that show basically goes through the corruption of the gun trace task force. And again, could talk for a whole podcast probably about that situation. But put very, very simply, we on a couple of occasions filmed some of the people who ended up being implicated in a federal indictment for RICO and all of that. And so they ended up using that footage in this show.
Wow.
Moving forward from there, though, really, as the Trump movement began to happen, the right started doing political activism. And so the sort of being able to cover all sides really came more to fruition in that sort of 2016 and on time period. And so some notable situations that I was able to cover very close up in this style was the inauguration of President Trump drew both Trump supporters there for him, as well as enormous and sometimes vandalous counter protests, as well as mass arrests and massive police response that came from it. The violence that occurred in Charlottesville and the events leading up to and following it, which has been widely sort of described as the summer of hate.
Yeah.
And more recently, January 6th, of course. So over the course of the few months from November 3rd of 2020 to sort of January 6th, 2021, nearly every day I was filming and had contributors filming the situations of people protesting, counter-protesting over their viewpoints, over the legitimacy of the election, but really watching a moment when democracy was sort of in crisis. And I continue to cover the sorts of demonstrations that are happening today, although I'll say that much like the Obama era, right now I think that there are some certain tensions that are perhaps a little bit quieter for now. But political activism has decreased a bit. So there, environmental policy, for example, hasn't changed so much, but it's been harder for environmental activists to get people out on the streets. It's more like dozens or maybe 100 people who can come out to an adversarial environmental event, as opposed to the thousands that might have come out when they had the Orange Man to be protesting against.
So what kind of tensions do you think are lurking beneath the surface at the moment?
Sure. And I mean, that's a big question, but I will briefly say that, polling kind of shows that the political viewpoints that more or less led to January 6th haven't actually really gone away or changed, right? So January 6th fundamentally was about people believing that that democracy has died, that they actually won the election, and that through some kind of fraud, conspiracy, etc., that it was taken from them, and they and ultimately that turned into violence. That anger translated into violence. And when polled, Republicans, for the most part, have not changed their attitude about that since then, and the approval rating for Trump among Republicans hasn't really changed. So, accordingly, with Trump saying that he is going to run again, he has all but said that, right? It's like he was very clear. He said, "I think you're all going to be very happy with my decision, which I've already made." So Trump is Trump at least says that he's going to run again.
Yeah.
You could offer some theories as to why he might say that, even if it wasn't true. It is possible that a catastrophic health event could change that plan. It is possible that he might decide not to for some other reason. But generally, he is saying that he will. And even if he doesn't, his endorsement means a lot to GOP candidates. And so it is, I think, fairly likely that even if Trump wasn't the nominee, it would be because Trump endorsed somebody else, a sort of proto-Trump, to follow him. And so I don't want to get too much into predictions, but I would say that with it looking like it will be a contest between Trump or a Trump endorsed person versus Biden or a Biden endorsed person, you would likely have somewhat of a repeat of 2020, something that is perceived as a rematch. And I think that it is entirely possible that, especially if it's a close call, that you could have essentially the same conditions set up. Trump has been telling his people that the election was stolen from him, and he still believes that, and so do they.
Yeah.
You would likely have the same sorts of arguments being made by whoever ostensibly loses against whoever ostensibly wins in 2024. And so I think that tension, the fact that probably 50 or 60 million people in this country fundamentally believe that democracy has failed, could really, really erupt when they will have been able to sit on that for 4 years, as opposed to only a couple months between November 3rd and January 6th.
I definitely would agree with you. I am. That's something that I haven't even really thought about that much. I'm kind of in my own little world, right? Just hanging out, working out, producing a podcast. But when I start thinking about the fucking chaos that we're going to have during this election cycle, it's exciting to me because people just lose their goddamn minds over it. And I'm like, I mean, it doesn't matter really who's in office. Like, how much does your life really change, right? And none of my political views, like, I'm pretty much politically homeless outside of like the Libertarian Party, but they're crazy as well. But I like I'm a big fan of like small government. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure that Biden would run again. Like, what kind of, you're much closer to these things than I am, so I'm kind of curious. Like, what do you have any? You've got your finger kind of on the pulse. Is that something that he's talking about or considering? Like, what kinds of things are you hearing?
I've heard sort of mixed reports on how clear he's been about with his inner circle about that. So, I mean, it's not like I have any particular level of insight, but from the stories that I've read, it sounds like he's basically been telling advisors that he's good to go. But even if he didn't, if he decided that he wants to be a one-term president, and again, at his age, it would be pretty normal for some kind of health event or health evaluation to change his decision. He could fully be prepared for it right now, but decide, a year from today, I just don't feel like I have another 4 years in me. But with that being said, as the president, he is the leader of not only the country, but the Democratic Party. And so in all likelihood, much like I'm saying that for Trump, his endorsement would go a really long way. It would be really, really hard for the RNC to nominate someone who is not Trump endorsed. In the same way, I think it would be pretty challenging for an insurgent Democratic candidate to primary Joe Biden or to be victorious over a Joe Biden endorsed person, right? So you could have somebody like Bernie run in a primary against, say, Kamala Harris, who is endorsed by Biden in this fictional scenario or this projective scenario. And I think it would be an enormous uphill battle for whoever is running to justify that run, especially because much of the rhetoric would be focused around, you're just going to help Trump win. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that whether it ends up being Trump Biden or Trump versus Harris or Biden versus DeSantis or something, ideologically that's more or less what we're probably looking at, a Trump ideological person versus a centrist presenting kind of like Democrat.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't been alive that long, right? I'm 30 years old, and I have never seen the level of attachment to a person outside of the
Right.
Trumpers. Like, it is fucking wild. It's just it's complete chaos. Like, it's almost a cult, in my opinion, right? It is like there's this fever Like he's kind of like the king of the assholes, and love him or hate him, like he's a very polarizing character. I liked when he was president. I was never not entertained. I laughed all the time, but the division that he seems to cause in the country, I'm not super pumped about him necessarily running once again. But I mean, I'm sure that we're going to get it, and it is going to be one of those crazy things, and you'll have a lot of things to cover. Of that, I am pretty positive.
I will just something to add on that. I think that when I have covered Trump supporters, Trump rallies, etc., as opposed to most other types of single issue events that I cover, where the divergence is in beliefs about sort of other stuff, and then they kind of all unify around one issue.
Yeah.
And with a lot of other candidates, the candidate is sort of trying to represent the feelings of people that are already out there, or trying to represent a new way, right? So Bernie Sanders has, these are uncharted waters for, the politics that he's trying to present, but he wants to convince people of them. But fundamentally, what he's trying to convince them of is his sort of philosophy of being a social democrat. But with Trump, it's not like that, or like, say, Ron Paul trying to turn people on to libertarianism. Trump is turning people on to Trump.
Yes, yes.
So he is a lot of things to a lot of people. And so I meet people who identify with extremely divergent actual points of view on sort of why they support him. And yet they kind of, they form around his exact personality. Like he is the single issue himself.
I have never seen. It's brilliant. It's like the media turned him into a rock star by just trying to trash him. And you can't, he's got that New Yorker, like, I don't give a fuck attitude, and he just wouldn't be stopped. I've never seen anything like it. It's been fascinating to watch. You did mention someone, I mean, you don't mention Ron Paul on this podcast and not get a shout out.
Yeah, just casual Ron Paul drama. Right.
I fucking love that man so much. That's the only time in my life, I was in college, the only time in my life I was like, that's not true, but one of the very few times I've been so balls deep into politics. And I was devastated when he lost, I think it's the Iowa caucus. He had some hope going into that. No one would ever ask him questions when they were doing the debates, because he would destroy everyone. I was really hopeful that he would become a president. John, no, not going to let you talk. And I'm just kidding. Come on, Brett. What's up, John?
I was just going to say, I worked for Ron Paul's campaign in 2008. So there you go.
Really?
Yeah. That was the first election that I was eligible to vote. And I was just like, okay, that guy. And so I ended up signing up, and I was a delegate to the Indiana Republican convention for him. There was some obviously hinky stuff that went on that, I'd be happy to talk about off camera.
Yeah, we weren't ready for the Ron Paul revolution, man. I was really hopeful. So what are some of the extremist groups like you've kind of documented during your career?
Yeah, so I will I'm happy to share one that comes to mind, but I will say that in general, I try not to attach the term extremist to any particular group.
That's fair.
So I cover the extremities of American politics, because the most extreme people about anything, right? Some are going to be represented by themselves going out onto the street. But in some ways, the people you're documenting are very much a part of the American democratic process. And so I think that the label of extremist, in some ways, it might escalate them. But in other ways, right, it could be argued that they're actually quite representative of sort of what's going on, or the direction things have gone, right? Some people would argue that Bernie's followers are extreme. Some people would argue that Trump's followers are extreme, right? Like, so it all depends on perspective. But, I will certainly say that, like, filming in Charlottesville, for example, really brought, I think, a coalition of the most extreme groups. So the concept of that event, it had been titled Unite the Right. And in theory, what it was supposed to do was unite basically hard right groups that were apathetic about like race, to groups that were explicitly neo-Nazi, white nationalist, the types of people chanting "Jews will not replace us" and "Free Dylan Roof," and just extremely wildly racist points of view. And what was sort of interesting about that situation, beyond, of course, the tragedy of the amount of violence and death that occurred, but in terms of political coalition being something that I really focus on, sort of studying who is capable of going out and working with who else, and what issues can they set aside for what joint issues, right? Unite the Right in Charlottesville was supposed to bring together all of these different diverging perspectives of the far right, but the leading up to it, as certain groups such as the Proud Boys found out what kinds of other groups were going to be there, the hardcore neo-Nazis and so forth, and they didn't want to be associated. What kind of happened leading up to it is that the groups perceived as less extreme sort of shaved off of it, and so that it was largely groups that were just openly happy to be labeled white nationalists and were, white nationalists and neo-Nazis and so forth that showed up, and those handful of people who, even if they don't identify with those labels, they felt fully well what they were attending.
Yeah.
And it also had the opposite ultimate effect from what the organizers were trying to do, because with their claim being that the event is to unite the right, in reality, following what happened there was violence that took place, but there weren't, and people died, but speeches weren't given, and people were finger pointing over essentially the failure of organizing that had led to that mayhem. And so in the aftermath of it, as these guys are getting arrested and some are going to prison, they're getting sued into oblivion. And actually, more recently, a civil lawsuit basically accusing them of conspiring to commit civil rights violations based on race. Succeeded. And so, basically they now have financial judgments against them. It's really led to them actually finger pointing at one another over why it happened. And so so if you keep track of the people who actually attended sort of as leadership at that event, many of them spend their time blaming the others, saying, he's responsible for the event, or he's responsible for it going wrong or turning violent or whatever. And so it really had the opposite effect. And whereas the alt-right was getting all of this media attention, the New York Times is writing these sort of silly stories like the neo-Nazi next door and making observations about, wow, this neo-Nazi, he eats dinner and has a wife like other human beings. Like, look how interesting, right? Like, that was kind of their payday. That was their at their most popular. All the media is talking about them. And then following Charlottesville, the conversation about them was pretty much exclusively tied to Charlottesville, and they no longer were kind of cool, even in their own eyes. Their movements basically fell apart. Some of them managed to rebrand, but for the most part, that fell away. And in the time after that, groups that were of the hard right, even groups that were pretty open and proud about their participation in street violence, managed to succeed when they distanced themselves from the alt-right. So I would basically say, for example, the Proud Boys exploded in membership from 2018 through 2020, and then essentially up until January 6th, where they were saying, look, we have an Afro-Cuban, chairman. We are civic nationalists. We fight for America, but we're not racist, is what they would, say in the media and so forth. And that was a message that kind of got them much more included in the Trump group, right? The Trump supporters were like, those people at Unite the Right, like that, we've never seen anything like that. That's not part of us. The Proud Boys are welcome with open arms at Trump events. And so that kind of shift in the rhetoric of who was out on the streets seemed to really change. And of course it changed again after January 6th.
Yeah. You corrected me, and I thank you for that, because that is a piece of rhetoric that I'm using. Extremist groups, like, I don't know any of these people. I haven't done the research on these groups, right? I'm not as versed. I think that's very, very important. Language is very, very important. And so I appreciate you doing that, man, because I don't, the whole ethos of this show are things are stranger than they seem, and that you need to look into things and try and understand one another and talk, right? I think that's super important, which kind of brings me to the next point, whereas, like, independent journalism. Like, is this kind of the renaissance of this movement that's going on? Because a lot of the large media outlets have lost trust. And hopefully, I don't trust them. I don't even watch the news. There's nothing good on the news ever. It's all fucking depressing. And I feel like it's a giant, almost like a conspiracy to fearmonger people, to keep us sick in our minds and spread fear. And I view fear as an illness in your mind. Like it paralyzes you, keeps you from making good decisions. It turns someone that you don't know into the other, and then you're afraid. Like the virus that just went around was the worst thing, because people were afraid of one another. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want to get sick. So I think, as I was stating before, it's very important to have independent journalism. And where do you kind of see this going in the future? Do you think that most of us will consume media that way, or kind of walk us through this part of your industry?
Yeah. So, I think I see myself as sort of filling in a gap to be a solution or an alternative to the kind of issue that you just described. The way that I interpret the trend of the mainstream media is that I think they tend to benefit on all sides from the idea that there are only two sides. This very binary representation of there's the left and the right, and it serves sort of a couple of purposes. Firstly, it creates kind of this othering where you have to choose, you're on red team or you're on blue team.
Yeah.
And and there isn't common ground between you, but it also has the effect of preventing there from being, any other perspectives, right? If they can limit the direction of what you're allowed to talk about into the, whatever Overton window, the two sides that they present, you're not allowed to go outside the bounds of that in any given direction. So it sort of defends the existing power structure by giving you a limited amount of space in which to debate, and it gives you that kind of like feeling of anger when they get to report on, look at what the other team is doing and look at how wonderful your team is doing, right? You can feel like you're patting yourself on the back when it's your side, and whatever. Again, I think that the world is not that binary, right? No. People are just more complex in their beliefs, their attitudes, their identities, right? People are just complicated. And I think you learn a lot more about those sorts of perspectives by being out on the street, actually talking to them. And I think that there is a thirst for that. So your question was sort of like, where do you see the media going as a trend? I think that the problem is that there is enough of an appetite that for that kind of just tell me, just watch Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity and just hear about how the other side is like shit and how your side is really you just get to pat yourself on the back and be like, oh, thank God I'm not that team. Yeah. Right. Enough people watch that stuff that's profitable, and that would really have to change. I think that there would have to sort of be a societal awakening to some extent, that kind of news isn't actually that beneficial or isn't actually that informative. So for me, I'm presenting it kind of to whoever will listen. And what's interesting is that I am obviously out here, as I'm describing all of this, I'm criticizing the style of the mainstream media, but I also license to them, right? Yeah. So the mainstream media, if they miss something that ends up being important to what they want to say, I license to them, and I'm happy to do that. The value that I see and the kind of interrelationship, and it's something that I would encourage other independent journalists to be thinking about, is that my viewpoint is not I've seen some animosity where independent journalists will say mainstream media, and they mean something that they kind of hate, right? It's almost like this binary of, are you independent or are you mainstream? Yeah. And I wouldn't encourage that line of thinking either. I think that it actually improves them to have primary source work that can hold them accountable. When CNN goes and covers a rally, say they go and film, and they film some interviews, and maybe they film all the speeches or whatever, and then they package it into 2.5 minutes for air, the audience doesn't get to see what they cut it all down from, right? So they're going to probably cut it down into the most divisive comments, the most ridiculous things that the speaker says, the most extreme things that the interviewees say. And so what you're left with is an extreme view of what that situation was. When I cover something, I live stream it beginning to end. When I'm able to. Sometimes cell services interrupts it and whatever. But for the most part, I try to live stream events beginning to end. And my philosophy about that is that when I then put out a summary where I cut down into maybe 10 minutes of raw video, no narration, no commentary, none of my face, just here are the parts I thought were the most important, you can still compare that to the original. So even that bit of editing down for length, people can kind of check on in a way that they can't with CNN. But if CNN licenses from me or whoever else, my name is on the screen, and I often will tweet, they use this thing, and then I can show right after it, and this is the context of it. And it's not a criticism of them saying that they took it out of context. They're using it in a new context. They're making something new out of it. But the ability to see that original sort of holds them accountable in a way that they aren't when they don't work with me or someone like me.
Isn't that just pretty nefarious, though? Right? Like, I'm glad that you are moral and are like, yo, this is the actual context. But isn't that a little bit nefarious when you are taking something that's out of context and trying to form your own narrative? You're lying. You're not actually telling the truth. You're fucking lying. That's not good.
When I was in college, there was I don't remember if this was quoting or if it was just a professor who said it to me, but basically it was that when you convert anything into any medium, it becomes fiction.
Yeah.
Right. And so the step that I would take after that is, if you take that as a basic truth, that turning anything into a medium is fiction, then what I seek to do, and what I think media generally should seek to do, is to subvert the fictionalizing element of medium. And so what I mean by that is that it is inherently true that how you present something is going to affect people's understanding of it, and nothing can replace the truth of a thing that actually happened. So, if you just write about something, just text on a page, you could write something that is completely filled with true facts, and somebody else could write it with that same situation, and it could also be 100% truth, and you could have two completely different documents.
Yeah.
You could photograph something, and then now you have an idea of what the thing looked like. If you film it, you have 30 photographs every second and sound, right? So now, you might have an idea of what it sounds like, but in a moment in time. And so when I think about live streaming, the reason that live stream works, if you're really breaking it down and thinking of it philosophically like that, is that you are removing the fictionalizing elements of editing discretion, right? That the fact of it being real time means that you are seeing a truth of the timeline. There still is the discretion of where somebody moves, right? If there's multiple things going on, where I go, my choice of what to cover, right? Like, all of these things are matters of discretion that any human being attempting to present something is going to have to make those sorts of choices. But so the goal should be the closest to truth that is possible. In my view, that is basically to live stream and then present highlights, so that people can see what mattered, right? The question after something being what if the thing mattered. I realize that this isn't applicable to every type of journalism, though, right? If WikiLeaks releases 250,000 documents, right? Technically, the absolute truth of that would just be to upload 250,000 documents on CNN.com. That's not how people consume journalism, right?
Yeah, no.
So I would appreciate it if CNN linked to those documents when they quoted from them, right? That would be kind of the equivalent of what I'm talking about. But the point is that, different journalists have to find their own different type of language. Most independent journalists aren't going out to things the way that I'm describing. And so, for every individual person, they have to figure out what their exact philosophy, what the way that they approach it is. And so for me, this is my way of presenting truth. It's my truth of what truth is. But I also understand that for other people, they may view it as to find a very brief way to present it where they're cutting it down and whatever. I absolutely think that in the mainstream media's case, that often is done in bad faith.
Yes.
And where they aren't making that context available, not just out of inconvenience or out of some ideological difference, but because they sincerely just don't want to, right?
Yeah.
That they don't actually want that kind of accountability.
Yeah, man, 100%. And it's a giant problem. I don't know how we're going to fix it. We just have to continue to vote with our dollars. But I mean, another big problem, right? The emphasis also has to be on the individual, the people, right? When I'm confused, I try not to go to the internet for answers. I try to go to books. I like to read. I think that that's kind of the best way really to do something. If you're confused, you can generally find moments in history that kind of explain why we are here, or that this has happened before. Like I just figured out. I don't know if you know of this gentleman. Do you know who Hudson Lafayette Hunt is?
I don't think so. No.
Oh man, so he's an oil tycoon. He won a deed to an East Oil Texas claim in a card game in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, and struck black gold and became one of the wealthiest men in America. And he had a conservative talk show or conservative show. I can't remember the name. John, will you look up H.L. Hunt's radio show? It was distributed to like 500 stations, and it was to promote like conservative agendas across the state. He was a Baptist, so he fucking hated Kennedy because he was a Catholic, and he thought that a Roman Catholic, excuse me, that the that religious freedoms would be completely lost if he became president. And so I'm just kind of learning about this guy, and I'm like, okay, so is this like the kind of the first instance of someone that has a shit ton of money that is funding that's a political activist, right, in American history? I'm sure it's not, but I'm sure it's not. But like you kind of still see that kind of language going on with fundamentalist Christian organizations. Like they're very powerful. Go ahead, John.
So it was called Lifeline.
Lifeline. Thank you.
And also, while we're on the sidebar,
he's also known as H.L. Hunt.
H.L. Hunt. Thank you.
I think you said late 1800s earlier, but then you said Kennedy.
No. So like, I think he was born in 18, like I think it was like 1889.
Yeah, he died in 76.
Okay.
So
that wasn't when he got the oil thing.
No, he got the oil thing in the like early 1900s. So I know he was born in the I believe. John, will you look up when I think it's like 1889.
1889.
Ooh,
yep.
Okay.
Died in 74.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so definitely look into. He's a fascinating character, very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sure he's I think he's like a white supremacist race, but I mean, he's kind of implicated in the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is a very fascinating thing because there's a conspiracy there. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, listeners, the MLK tapes. Checked out. It's an investigative journalism podcast about the assassination of Martin Luther King. There's a plug for that. It's great. But sorry, we're definitely off on a sidebar now. But yeah. I mean, do you know anything about? To my knowledge, I've talked to some people. They said that there's a pretty intense like fundamentalist Christian movement that's like kind of underground that's going on. Like, do you know anything about that?
I don't know how much I would use the term underground, but I would say that in the later period of time of the Trump movement and kind of now in the, I guess what I'd call the post-MAGA movement, the people who participated in MAGA who are still doing activism, there was a strain of kind of connecting right-wing politics with Christianity in a way that is fairly unique. So that has been something that's been happening generally since essentially Reagan. But it really came across a lot in that 2020 time period where you had, at the Million MAGA March, people chanting Christ is King and so forth. And so it's interesting to me, especially because I think it's a good example almost of what we were talking about before about how Trump kind of could represent whatever to whoever. Yeah. And so like when I was covering the campaigns, so 2016 before the election, I actually went to a conference called Faith and Freedom, and it was basically a very conservative Christian conference. And then primary candidate Trump spoke at it, and it was very interesting to me because I've been at other Trump events, and I had been at other Trump events by then, And Trump's audience really liked him largely because of how profane he could be about politics in a way that other politicians wouldn't. That he'd be, he'd say that like, oh, it's bullshit, and everyone would be like, wow, right? He called, Ted Cruz the P word, which I don't want to repeat because I don't want people to like, cut it, whatever. But at a rally, and then he said that he was quoting, but he said it out loud, and his audience loved it, and whatever, right? But at the Faith and Freedom Conference, right, that was a speech I basically haven't seen used archivally pretty much ever since then. And it wasn't because it wasn't interesting. He was just much more somber. It sounded like he was trying to kind of imitate what he thought that a Christian conservative sounded like. And I realize there might be people listening to this right now who perceive Trump as a Christian conservative himself. But you're laughing as I say that. Right?
That's funny. Yeah.
But I mean, during that time period, Trump was going to church sometimes to kind of be photographed going to church. And, he was interviewed and it was asked, like, do you like the Old Testament better or the New Testament? He was like, I like them about the same. They were like, do you have a favorite verse? He's like, that's very personal.
Oh, my God, dude. What a great answer. What a great answer.
But at Faith and Freedom, the point that I was sort of getting to was he just approached it with a much more somber tone, speaking to that particular audience. I remember he like the kind of moments that he sounded like he was a little bit more flair. He's like, we are going to bring Jesus back into school. Like, it didn't sound like something that he had. It didn't seem very foundational to his platform. It didn't seem like it was an extremely important thing to him, but this was him trying to court a very significant portion of the Republican voting base. And I think that to some extent, he relied on Pence really to bring in the, that kind of person in the end. What's interesting now is that, Pence was sort of whittled off of the Trump coalition. At this point, Pence's political aspirations may have hit kind of a dead end because of his refusal to stick with Trump in the kind of plot to stay in the presidency, despite the results being kind of counted, obviously, the opposite way. And Pence feeling that he had a constitutional duty not to interfere with that. But at this point now, if Trump runs again, he'd have to basically pick a different vice president and so forth. And so it would be very interesting to see if he was looking for another conservative Christian kind of person like that, or whether he would choose like a true Trump loyalist who is, like, congratulations, Don Jr. Do you want to be the vice president?
Oh, Jesus.
Of course, I'm kidding about that, but it'll be interesting to see how that goes, assuming he does run again.
So during when he was on his way out, and I said, there's a caveat. I never loved him more. Everyone's like, he's so bad. I'm like, dude, I related to him. I related to that man that is just grasping at power, because there's a side of me that's like a megalomaniac, just a crazy person. I was like, I wouldn't want to give up power either. I would be using every trick in the book to stay in power. So I felt like I never related to the man more during his.
God, if you ever run for office,
do
just
not vote for me. Like,
no, I do not vote for Rick. I will personally put him down if he tries to run for office.
Do not vote for me. I would be a horrible president. I mean, I think I would be awesome, but like, it would be a dictator. I would be benevolent dictator. Yeah, I could tell you about Pan-American.
Didn't you say you're a libertarian?
I know.
Take over the world and then leave everyone alone.
Oh, here's the thing, man. I'm obsessed with empire. Like in like from a historical. It's like, okay, like, all jokes aside, I do not agree.
Typical libertarian. You love power, but you don't want to say it.
Hold on. All jokes aside here, this is very important. I'm on a bit of a tirade here, but when I look at Putin, I do not agree with him invading Ukraine. I think it's awful. It's atrocious. But on one,
you're about to say but.
There is a side of me that's like, I get it. Like, he's just like, you know what? I want this. I'm gonna take it. Like, from a historical context, we admire, at least I do, empires, military history. I'm a giant military. Like, I look at Genghis Khan and the Mongol and the Horde, right? That was amazing. You look at Alexander the Great, amazing. Some of the pharaonic dynasties, amazing. The Yuan dynasty, all these things. they're all bad people. They're all terrible. They saw something they wanted and they fucking took it. They took a bunch of loot, slaves back, and then they got rich from doing that. It's interesting if one views yourself like if you're Putin, you're like, you know what, why not? Why can't I have an empire to this day? It's just interesting that one person could make the decision, said, I want to invade. I think that that's fascinating. Again, I disagree, but like, who wouldn't want to be in that position to be able to do something like that? Again, don't ever vote for me.
How did you feel when Trump was floating the idea of purchasing Greenland? Did that make you feel any sort of way?
So actually, funny story, he's not the first president to do that. Did you know that?
Oh.
Yes,
tell me about that.
I believe John pulled this up because we're going to dig in way back. I believe Truman offered to purchase Greenland from Denmark because it would be tactically, it's a great place to have bases and whatnot. Like we really have always wanted that. Go ahead.
So there have been 4 proposals by the United States to buy Greenland. The first was William Stewart, the Secretary of State, in 1867. Then the American ambassador to Denmark, Maurice Francis Egan, in 1910. And then in 1946, U.S. Senator Owen Brewster brought it up.
I thought one of our, type in president tries to buy, Truman tries to buy Greenland. I thought he did.
I will look on
it was true. Was it Harry? Yeah, Harry S. Truman. He dropped the bomb. Okay, I think it was him. But
1946. His administration tried. They offered Denmark $100 million in gold.
Yeah, to buy Greenland. Okay, I knew I wasn't fucking going crazy.
That sounds like a pretty respectable deal.
I think we should. Dude, I would love to own Greenland. I mean.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, right. But strategically, it's a great base. It would be a great military base to have. But I didn't know Trump offered to buy Greenland. What was his reasoning?
He floated. He brought up the idea, and it was interesting because I remember a lot of. This was something that I think wasn't taken extremely seriously, and I remember a lot of jokes were made about how he just wants a new place for golf courses and things like that. So I don't honestly, from memory, I don't remember a whole lot of serious debate taking place over the subject.
Okay, yeah, I mean, he's a character. I think it's not the best for America. I think that we're a little bit too fragile and the division that it would cause. So I'm hoping he doesn't run. I think we're kind of screwed, and I think that you're going to get a lot of interesting content when this kicks off. But outside of that, all jokes aside, don't ever vote for me. That's number one. But I wanted to kind of get into what you've been doing this for a long time. And has there ever been an issue or a movement that has kind of you maybe opened your eyes to something that you didn't know you cared about, and then you kind of find out that you did?
So that's an interesting question. I think that something that I've found interesting and sort of strange to cover has been issues related to censorship online. Mm-hmm. And specifically content moderation basically on social media. And this has been challenging for me because I try not to do advocacy for any kind of issue publicly. Right. I don't want to sort of, if I was to state openly a position on gun rights or environmental things or taxes or whatever, right, then it might undermine the perspective of my work. But at the same time, I fairly vigorously advocate for the right to do what my work is. And so I see essentially arguments for free speech, whatever that can mean. And there's a lot of ways that can go. But to be consistent with the act of objective journalism. So even if I'm not trying to guide people's political philosophies, I am trying to sort of guide the world away from content moderation that comes at the expense of journalists. And so it's been strange for me because to a large extent, that's been an issue that the political right has adopted. But I don't see that as actually historically consistent. So it is, to be sure, it is absolutely true that the political right has its fair share of being basically censored, kicked off of social media, and so forth. And I also want to be clear that when I say censor, I don't mean illegally censored. I don't mean being censored by the state. But that they say something, that thing is forbidden to be said, and then they are removed from the internet, or from some specific internet site.
Yeah.
The right has taken that up as an issue, in the last 4 years in particular. But as a general issue, free speech has historically been more of something that was talked about on the left. It has often been the right that has threatened, for example, music. That hip hop and that heavy metal, that's what's really going to, destroy the children.
Video games. Yeah.
Right, like video games are quintessentially speech, right? They are art. They are an artistic expression.
Pornography on the right as well.
Right. I mean, very recently that's been, and it's been interesting because the right has been, for all their talk of free speech, like there's been a much greater abundance, like in the last year, of the right having concerns about that. And so now you have sort of the left talking about, if like Democrats in Congress versus Republicans in Congress, we'll put it that way, as opposed to me saying the left and the right. The Republicans in Congress are spending a lot of time talking about their fear over, like you just said, like sexual content on the internet and so forth. Whereas, and they want to try to regulate that away. Right. Or they feel that it's that companies, even with PG rated content, are threatening sort of the moral innocence of children. And so this is kind of the issue happening in Florida, where, Ron DeSantis is taking away special tax status that was granted to Disney, essentially because of the belief that Disney is presenting, content that teaches kids about sexuality. And again, I don't want to try to take sides in that particular claim or argument or whatever. But it is obviously clear that the right has taken a step back toward like what they were doing very much like in the 90s about music and video games and so forth. The left, or I should say the Democratic Party in Congress, when they drag social media executives in front of them, they're the ones saying, why aren't you removing this kind of content, and why are you allowing that kind of content? And so both sides are kind of weaponizing the concept of preventing speech against the other in certain contexts. And so I personally see the way that it affects journalism as being not bound by any particular side, right? So my journalism is not particularly favored by one side over the other, right? I think I have a fairly diverse political audience. And yet on Facebook, I've had my account entirely removed and then had to basically fight to get it back by advocating. On Twitter, my entire account was marked the way that porn is for 5 months following January 6th. It said anything that I tweeted that had a link, a text, a link, video, or photo, anything other than text, it would say, this is potentially sensitive content. Wow. And then my entire profile was marked as potentially sensitive content.
Wow.
And so you would have to change your settings to even be able to then press the button to see my profile, and then press the button in order to see my tweets. And eventually that was also sort of changed. But then, and YouTube has demonetized my entire channel twice, both times only changing that back after it received significant media attention. So it's affected me a lot. And as I've watched political, journalists who cover politics suffer these same sorts of issues and often have a lot less success fighting them against these big corporations, that has really affected the left as well as the right. There was a purge in 2018 on Facebook that largely focused on like cannabis pages and anti-war pages and pro-Palestine pages. And so those issues are not exclusive to the left, but those are issues that would generally be associated with left and libertarian and anarchism as opposed to the right. But you didn't see Don Jr. complaining about that and so forth, right? So my point, I guess, is that has been the one issue that I have sort of advocated on, where I've actually said when I think that a policy is fundamentally bad or dangerous or going to be used in an incorrect way, because I have examples in my own life of my own work being affected by that, and that's something on which I cannot just remain like unable to speak out.
Yeah, 100%. The bottom line is, like, when I see people go down that road of saying, like, oh, we can't have this, we got to have every single type of speech. I mean, yes, it sucks. Like, do I, as a black person, want to see hate speech on the internet? No, not really. But, like, I would never pass a law or do anything to get that taken down, right? Like, I think that it all needs to be out, because the best thing the best thing against bad speech is more speech, right? Like, you need to have. I could cite a few examples, like one of the Fred Phelps, the Westboro Baptist Church, one of his daughters would get on Twitter and freak out, and then through her interactions with people, she'd go, wait, why is this person going to go to hell? Like, this is a really good, like, nice person. I didn't know these things about the Bible. Like, wait, am I crazy? Right. So like, if you start picking and choosing what people see in a very curated form, like, you're not going to get those opportunities to save people or change their minds. And also with someone like you that is putting out, live streaming things that maybe they don't want to see. Maybe there's a different angle that these tech companies don't agree with. Like, that's also very dangerous, because that's silencing you. And when you start silencing human beings, they go off the radar. They don't get they get really into a echo chamber, so to speak, and they're not going to ever have their ideas challenged. So I am 100% on, I share your opinion that it's very dangerous when you start eliminating different viewpoints and different types of speech. I think the more, the better, right? I need to know. Well, I also need to know how crazy you are, right? I don't want you to just be saying things that I agree with.
Right. And so, to give a very specific example of kind of the problem that I think we're sort of alluding to, and also the issue of the fact that it's not usually humans making these decisions in a well thought about way. It's often robots sort of doing it for them. In 2019, the first time I was demonetized by YouTube, one of the videos that they found that they took down along with the demonetization of the whole channel, so clearly it was part of what motivated them, was I had a video outside the American Israel Political Action Conference, where every year, basically, supporters of America funding Israel and giving them weapons and so forth gather, and generally pro-Palestine protesters are outside, basically countering it. And there was actually a situation that I've covered that a few different times, but there was a situation that I filmed at the 2019 iteration of this, so early 2019, where as people are arguing back and forth about this subject, a Holocaust denier shows up. A guy shows up, and his point of view is that Israel doesn't have a right to exist because, and then he basically spews disinformation about the Holocaust. And what was really interesting to me that happened was that people from the pro-Israel side and people from the pro-Palestine side sort of joined forces, as it were, for that moment. And for about 10 minutes, people on both sides of it were arguing with him that foundationally his beliefs were batshit insane, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
And again, typically I wouldn't take like I'm not describing to you my views of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I'm certainly comfortable saying, that the Holocaust denier is wrong because he's making a statement of fact that is false. Anyhow, they argue back and forth with him, and so I posted a video that said something like titled something like "Holocaust Denier Confronted by Pro-Israel and Pro-Palestine Activists" or something like that, and it was just raw footage of them arguing with him. And obviously, I think that to somebody watching it, the takeaway is that odd moment of unity, but to YouTube, who set a policy against Holocaust denial and then has robots enforcing that policy, it does not know the difference. A robot its process more or less probably looks like transcribing what was said. It's not making a difference between speakers and the context and the why and whatever. It just sees this guy repeatedly making false claims about the Holocaust, and then it says, "Oh, that's Holocaust denial content," takes it down, demonetizes the channel. Right. So part of the issue is that when you rely on non-human moderators to make these choices, it's never going to err on the side of being correct. And for someone like me, after months of advocating for the account to be restored to its full status, they admitted the mistake. But there are a lot of people whose content have been removed and they don't have any kind of remedy like that. In particular, I've heard from some people how like content creators who were dealing with LGBT content back in 2008 to 2010, a lot of that stuff, YouTube would just remove it because they would just assume that if you're talking about sexuality, you're porn, right? Like sort of a ridiculous leap. But that content would go down, and they had absolutely no remedy for it, even to a decade later. So any new policy that they pass, it's my opinion that they have to be prepared to have humans evaluate those things on a situation by situation basis, and that just clearly isn't happening. Where when I use their press a button to appeal and then write an appeal, many times that kind of thing, I've appealed, the appeal is denied, and then I publicly advocate about the specific case, and then they come back and say, oh, we made a mistake. But I am a public figure who's sort of capable of pressuring them that way, and the average YouTube user absolutely isn't.
Yeah, man, that's fucked. Is you're messing with someone's livelihood, and so if you're not a public figure, you're just not. You're just screwed. Like that's it's not good. That is not good. And to look at it from their perspective, they get I don't even know how many millions of videos are uploaded to YouTube each day. So you kind of have to have algorithms like enforcing this, because it's too much to handle. The amount of data that
it's
goes
100 new hours of video per minute. The last time that I read a stat on that.
That's insane. That's insane. So it's an impossible predicament. But I mean, bottom line is you still, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know. You're lucky. You're very fortunate that you can get that switch back. You haven't had any problems since then, have you?
Oh, I have. I mean, so most recently, to use an example, I filmed Coey Griffin is an elected official from New Mexico, and he was tried in Washington, D.C. for his involvement in January 6th. He had been charged with two misdemeanors. Basically, he wasn't accused of engaging in violence, and he didn't go inside the building. He's one of the only people who didn't go inside the building or hurt anybody and still got charged. And basically, he climbed up some scaffolding and so forth, and then while above, he led, I should say, the crowd in a prayer over a bullhorn. And he was charged with entering restricted grounds, and that's on the basis that Vice President Pence was physically present at the Capitol, and which makes it under Secret Service jurisdiction, which is how they come up with that misdemeanor, and disorderly conduct, essentially saying that his leading the prayer was sort of provoking, the people who were rioting. And he got a split verdict. He actually went to a bench trial. He over 2 days, the case was presented to a judge, and ultimately the judge basically said he did trespass, but I'm not going to call prayer disorderly conduct. That if anything, an act of prayer probably had a calming effect on the crowd. It's not like he probably would have been found guilty of that if instead of praying he said, let's burn this motherfucker to the ground or something. So in any event, I think that's quite interesting, right? Elected official, guilty on one, not guilty on the other. And he's only the second January 6th defendant to even go to trial at all. And so when he exited the courtroom, he had a lot to say and spoke for about a half hour. And so I filmed him speaking to the press. I asked a few questions during it, but basically I published a half-hour video of just uncut. Here's what Coey Griffin said when he exited the courthouse. And so backing up a second, YouTube has a standard that they created essentially during 2020 and then expanded upon following January 6th, where for certain types of things that would generally not be allowed on YouTube, such as documentation of certain types of violence or bullying, or hate speech being another one, that that they have what's called an ESDA exception: educational, scientific, documentary, or artistic. So you're allowed to show, for example, maybe a swastika and somebody saying Sig Heil or something, if it's in a music video and it's actually a music video about how Nazis are bad. Or, a Hitler speech would be allowed as an educational resource in a video, but it would not be allowed from an account called white supremacists,
white supremacists are us. Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. Whatever. But so So the ESDA exception, I actually think that to the extent that you're going to have these policies, I think that the ESDA exception actually makes perfect sense. That these sorts of things are allowed when in the context of education, science, documentary, and art. But when it comes to two subjects currently, YouTube requires a standard that they never actually articulated until they started censoring on this basis. So they have a countervailing views standard now, only for COVID and what they call election disinformation. And so what that means is that if somebody makes a claim about the efficacy of vaccines, for example, or the origins of COVID or whatever, that isn't even allowed in an educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic context unless you actually actively counteract those views. And the same thing is true of the election. The sentence, "the election was stolen," is flatly disallowed on the platform unless you actively show something that goes against it, even if you're not the one who said it in the first place. So the first time that I encountered this was that I filmed the Trump speech on January 6th. 70 minutes long, beginning to end, from the National Mall. I filmed as people reacted to hearing Trump's speech. Extremely obviously historical moment, right? This is the moment that he's allegedly inciting an insurrection, at the moment that he's allegedly inciting them, and I'm surrounded by the people he's allegedly inciting, right? If you were to agree with the impeachment of Trump, like, this is the impeachment of an American president hinges on the moments portrayed in this video. And YouTube took it down. They called my video election disinformation. It's footage of, at the time, the president of the United States speaking. It is an absolutely true account of a situation that took place, and YouTube, of course, believes that what Trump said is false, and therefore my video is false. So their expectation was, you can have that video back up if you post a countervailing view where you basically say the election wasn't stolen, or you present a source that that has that. And so what I have now had to do, whenever I have a video that basically has any aspect of election or COVID, is I put a text at the bottom that is apparently sufficient to satisfy this, that says countervailing views. And what I write is usually countervailing views as required by big tech. And then colon, and then I link to .gov websites that deal with these things. So what I usually link to is CISA.gov/rumor control is a website that describes election integrity methods, and CDC.gov/vaccines talks about vaccine information. And so I stick those at the bottom every time. And that's what allows my videos to stay up even when they have that sort of thing. Returning to Coey Griffin, the situation that happened only a few weeks ago, when he exited the courthouse, one of the things that he said was that he still thinks the election was stolen. He basically feels that his behavior on January 6th was in part justified because he still thinks the election was stolen. I actually included at the bottom of the screen countervailing views and then those websites that I just described. And YouTube took it down anyway and called the video election disinformation. And I appealed and said I was complying with your exact standard. I put the text that you require at the bottom of the screen. And the appeal was denied, and then I started posting about it publicly, and then they fixed it. But again, if I was an independent journalist, some freelancer who just caught that but didn't have an outlet to sell it to, so I stuck it on YouTube, I'd have a strike on my account, forever, that couldn't go away. And to just give, I know I'm dwelling on about this, but to give one other example, this was the most absurd example I've seen of this, but it shows just how obtuse the big tech systems can be, is that I filmed on Inauguration Day, 2 weeks to the day after January 6th, Joe Biden is inaugurated. And out of fears over January 6th, type stuff happening again, the whole city's locked down. So there's barely any activism in the city happening. You mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church earlier. Mm-hmm. There's a group that was very similar to Westboro Baptist. It turns out it wasn't them, but they had similar signs. God hates, disparaging term for gay people, and so forth. That showed up outside Union Station, so about a mile from where the inauguration is taking place. And it actually wasn't their words that caused my video to go down that day. It was, as they are spewing essentially hate speech, right? Describing people as whores and so forth. And in some cases, in a very targeted way, They were pointing out, someone on the street who they perceived to be underdressed, and they called her a whore, like, to her face.
Oh,
What was interesting was some people who were not organized counter protesters or anything like that just sort of started yelling at them from across the street. And one of the people who was actually shirtless at the time. He took his shirt off to make a point about that they're calling this woman a whore because her shorts are too short or whatever. And he yells at them, and now I've watched it like a million times, so I remember it verbatim. He says, "Correct your hate, correct your hate, correct your hate." He's screaming at them across the street, but I'll say it in normal tone. And then he says, "I still believe the election was stolen, but you, sir, are preaching the wrong form of Christianity. That woman that you just called a whore, that's a woman, a human fucking being." Those were the exact words that he said.
Mm-hmm.
YouTube took down this video and suspended me for a week from the platform because he said in one part of one of those sentences, "I still believe the election was stolen." So this is an 8-minute video of a hate group and people confronting them, and one shirtless random guy across the street in one half of one sentence out of him yelling at them says, "I still believe the election was stolen," and bam, that video is now removed for election disinformation, and I was actually suspended from the platform for posting for a week. Obviously, what happened, I assume, is that a computer analyzes it and it doesn't care about any of those other things, but it literally just sees the words, "I still believe the election was stolen," and it can't tell the difference between me filming a shirtless guy yelling at somebody across the street and saying that versus a guy with a red ball cap talking into his webcam and saying those exact words, and that being the point of his video. But even when I brought this to the attention of YouTube, they actually stood by it on this one. They said, "Well, you didn't have the countervailing view." And I was like, "The whole thing's countervailing views. He's the only person who thinks what he said." And they were like, "But you didn't counter that. Man. That's the view." You have to, put the warning under. And so I dislike it because my whole thing is primary source video. And as far as I'm concerned, even adding that little bit of text is actually outside my style. I don't like to add a counter. I don't want to argue with the people in the videos and have pop-ups describing why they're wrong, right? I trust my audience to figure it out. So I think it's unfortunate, but that's the policy they're working with right now. And I think that in general, it's going to be the people who have less power and are more marginalized that are going to actually get the shit end of the stick when it comes to this problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. Something's got to be done. They got to get better because I understand their point, but like when they're fucking with people like you and countless other creators and independent journalists and stuff are just like maybe disagreeing with like a certain narrative that's going on right now. Like it's kind of dangerous. Like there's part of me that believes these things are utilities, right? And that we have to apply the same types of strict free speech that we have that's protected under, with the United States government. And, but then there's another part of it. It's like, oh, they're private businesses. But I don't know, man. I need to look into this more. But I think Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice, I think his opinion that they need to be deemed as utilities is interesting. I haven't looked at the counterpoints to that and why that's negative. I don't know. I'm just saying at a glancing pass, I think that's something that I definitely should look into. I mean, I got to bring a lawyer on. We got to talk about that because that's interesting.
I struggle with it a lot because on that exact subject, like the way you define like who that applies to could basically like cause issues for anybody else, right? So I have a platform myself, right? I have a website, News to Share, right? Mm-hmm. And not everyone is entitled to be covered by me. Not everybody is entitled to report for me. And so if you were to find, like, what definition could you offer that would include no censorship of otherwise legal content on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, but not these other companies, right? Like, how do you, like, where exactly is the line drawn on that front? I think that's uniquely challenging. The other thing is that from my perspective, looking at it historically, it's not generally governments that are protecting speech. It's usually governments that are infringing speech. This is why the founders put that one right at the beginning of the Bill of Rights. We need to stop the state from doing that because historically it's the state that jeopardizes those things. And while in America it's fairly unique that it is less common that the state is the one infringing speech, I certainly don't want law enforcement dealing with that, right?
No.
I don't trust them to make decisions about what's censorship and not. And I also realize that these companies are global. And so if you're going to trust China or India, right, who have their own restrictions on certain types of speech, Russia just banned Instagram outright.
Yep.
I don't know that it sets a great precedent either to have governments choosing the way that these companies handle themselves, because if that government ends up choosing a dictator, right? What methods is that person going to use to protect their power? Probably censorship, right?
100%.
We can't assume that the leadership is always going to be committed to liberal democracy the way that you would hope as you impose a regulation like that.
100%. That's the problem, right? It's an interesting idea, but again, pretty much everything that the government touches turns to shit. So that, we just
Twitter.gov.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know that I'd want to use that website.
I'm sorry, don't you mean Twitter.Musk?
Let's go. Let's go. I'm excited about that.
You're the only one who's
excited about it. Listen, I'm thinking about buying some stock, but I don't know. I got to talk to some people that know a little bit more about money than I do. It seems like a safe bet, but
can I ask you a question actually on Musk?
Please.
On Musk. So I understand why people are excited about Musk, and I really genuinely hope that if that's the way forward, it's not a done deal yet, but if he owns it, I really hope that some of these issues go away from Twitter and maybe that other ones follow.
Yeah.
With that being said, Elon Musk lives within the United States, and he owns companies, and he has a lot to lose. And so fundamentally, he is a person who could probably be threatened, right? He has contracts with the government, right?
Yeah.
The government I remember there was some talk about when he smoked marijuana on Joe Rogan's show, like, if he's consuming cannabis, that actually makes him ineligible for government contracts. Did he just lose everything by smoking a joint?
Yes. Like SpaceX. It was some Air Force generals that were kind of pissed off about this, and his stock plummeted and whatnot. So yes, I'm aware. Right.
So if there was a controversial story, so let's say the Hunter Biden thing, for example, right? Jack Dorsey has taken back. Jack Dorsey has apologized. Basically, he said they made the wrong decision, suspending the New York Post and de-escalating reporting about the Hunter Biden laptop at the time. And I think that Jack Dorsey saying that is probably even more validated in the current time period, where now even the Washington Post and the New York Times are kind of posting these like apology stories about how we were wrong and we should have, let that be reported on. It shouldn't have been a verboten subject. If Elon Musk was the owner of Twitter and Joe Biden is the president, what if he said, I'll take away your contracts, or I'll arrest you, right? Or whatever. When you have just one person, and then that person has so much to lose, are you at all worried that Elon Musk could be sort of he talks a big game, but what if he's threatened by the state? Do you feel confidently that he'd be able to stand up strong on that?
Number one, I've never thought about it that way, so I appreciate that question. I think that it's not just going to be him. He's going to have a board of directors, right? And I think that the first thing he's going to set to do is separate himself from this thing. I think that he wants to own it and then maybe control it and institute some of the policies that he deems are fundamentally necessary, which is like as much freedom as humanly possible, right? And then outside of that, he might step away. And then I don't know if his plan is to make a shit ton of money and sell it. I don't know. From my understanding, it's going to be taken. It's going to be a private company. I think it's very interesting what you say, especially with the idea that he has a lot of lucrative government contracts, especially with SpaceX. I also think that he's a leader in a lot of those technologies because he was able to beat out, was it Blue Origin or whatever?
Blue Origin.
Blue Origin, yeah.
Blue Origin.
The Bezos company.
The space penis, yeah.
Yeah. I think that we are in in the Twitterverse, right? Which I'm not really that active on. I think we're in good hands. Like if you look at everything he's done and everything he's been able to accomplish, I think that he's probably the best person for that. I think his first move is probably to bring Dorsey back. Dorsey's kind of been ostracized and stepped away from Twitter, and I think maybe he has him run it. I don't know. You bring up a good point. I would say that for the most part, I don't think that those attack vectors that you speak of, I think that he's probably like 2 steps ahead of him. I don't know though. Good point, John. Go ahead.
So just to add to just focusing on Elon, I don't like Elon Musk, but we'll set that aside. Just on this issue, to echo what Ford was saying, my issue, what weirds me out about it is that you have a situation where you have essentially an oligarch controlling what has become the public square. Twitter is really one of the few, if not one of the only, social media platforms that is live, that you can, like, it is the best source of finding news or of finding information. If you are not literally there happening, is watching people live tweeting about it and seeing all this stuff coming through. And having that kind of powerful platform threatened by someone who has a history of having thin skin and retaliating in like ways that are not possible for the average person against journalists, critics, etc., that scares me. Just because he's kind of an erratic guy.
But time out. Can you please cite some examples of him attacking?
Yeah, I'll put in the show notes, but I know off the top of my head, I know that there was a former Tesla employee who started a YouTube channel that after he had complained internally about safety issues, like the whole thing with the Teslas just spontaneously combusting, had posted critical reviews of the Tesla cars on YouTube while maintaining that there was no information that was trade secrets or anything. It was all publicly available information. Was fired by Tesla. There was an instance where there was a journalist who was writing, it was either a critique of Musk personally or of Tesla as a company, was critical of them and actually had a pre-order for a Tesla car. Elon Musk personally went and canceled that pre-order without his knowledge, violating the contract that he signed while pre-ordering a car from his company. Those are the 2 that I can think of off the top of my head, but there's at least a few more that he floats that line between eccentric genius and eccentric villain. That is just it freaks me out that somebody so, for lack of a better word, unstable or unpredictable has so much power to control something so vital.
I don't know if it's fair that you can call him like unstable and unpredictable. Like he's
very unpredictable.
And also, time out real quick. What's the point of having fuck you money if you never get to say fuck you?
I mean, true,
that is
but
that is essentially what he did. He just said, "You know what? I'm the richest man on the planet, or one of 2. Technically,
depends
probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
There's definitely some
in
Saudi
reality,
families
not. It's all value. It's all valuation. He has almost all of his assets are all just hypothetical.
I'm also, one of my nicknames is the Agent of Chaos, so I like it. I like it. I want to see what happens. I think that if anything, it's going to get better. I really do.
I mean, in terms though, like, like Ford was saying, traditionally, free speech is an issue that falls on the left of center. And also, it's generally the state that's trespassing against people. We're in a system now that no one could account for in previous history, that corporations are essentially the state, especially when they are that big. When you have Twitter that's arguably bigger and more important now than, say, Ma Bell was 100 years ago, or you have YouTube and Google and Facebook that control how much, I mean, you would know, Ford, how much of your stuff do you get through Facebook links and through just people sharing stories? It's a massive vector that it's too dangerous to have that controlled by unaccountable singular parties. It's something that needs to be like regulated as a platform and as a not as a what do they fight because they don't want to be regulated as a platform. They want
versus
to be
publisher.
A publisher,
which
yes,
is mostly not a meaningful distinction. In the context of Section 230, it's just who wrote the thing, right? All you're a platform when somebody else wrote the thing that's on it, and you're a publisher when when Twitter tweets as Twitter, they're accountable to that. When I tweet, Twitter can't be sued for what I tweeted.
Yeah. And so it's important to have these platforms be open, because you'll run into a circumstance where, instead of you have, the government trying to shut down a newspaper, you have just a social media account, like everything that's happened to you on YouTube. They don't like it, whether it's personal or it's just an algorithm. It's too volatile.
But that's what Musk is trying to change. I mean, don't you think it's kind of fucking ridiculous that Putin's on Twitter and Trump's not?
I mean, yeah. I do.
We got to put him back on.
I don't think anything changes if you put Trump back on, except you just get more entertainment.
But I'm saying they shouldn't have. I don't think they should have kicked him off. Like I think that
right.
Elon having that. I think that dumb shit like that is going to stop. I think it's going to get a lot better. I mean, this is a man that has seen that we are storing carbon in our oceans and has made EV vehicles sexy and people want to buy them. This is a man that's trying to get us to Mars.
He has no legitimate solution to actually solve those problems. He's just trying to make money off the fact that you can make an electric car that's going to be powered by coal-powered electricity.
You have to keep making. That's not
to mention lithium mining is horrible for the environment.
I understand all of that, but we got to fucking do something, John. We got to do.
Right.
Sorry, this. By the way, Ford. This is a long-standing disagreement because I'm Team Elon. And he is like anti for whatever reason. You're wrong, but
lots of reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of seems like it goes with your philosophy that you were saying that you'd like to be a dictator who then is a libertarian dictator or something. Like,
like Pinochet. Are you going to try to say Pinochet was a libertarian?
No. I would not say that Pinochet was a libertarian. No. No, but like Elon is taking a huge amount of power, and it sounds like you, Rick, are comfortable with that because you believe that he will use it benevolently, that he actually will defend speech the way. So this is why I'm saying, assuming he buys it, I hope that that's true.
Me too. Same.
But I'm not sure that I'm just going to intrinsically trust any billionaire, right?
Yes,
I mean, it could have just as easily, like, if Bill Gates bought Twitter, I think that you'd be panicking.
Yeah, no, I'd be freaking the fuck out.
I'd be like, that's just right.
Everybody's panicked about.
He has the FU money, right?
Everybody's panicked about Elon Musk buying Twitter, but they're not panicked about the fact that the single largest private landowner in the country that owns the most farmland in the U.S. is Bill Gates.
I know, dude. We're not going to
both of those consolidations of power are bad, and like the ideas of like the whole Silicon Valley disrupt kind of ethos is great for business, but in reality and for society, it's not,
If Jeff Bezos was the one buying Twitter, he would have to ban guillotine as a search from Amazon.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I mean, it sounds like Elon's the one billionaire who's going after this and then saying, that he's going to lead it by free speech. But it's a lot of power to be in one hand, because if he changed his opinion, he very well could turn it the exact opposite way. So the difference between the perspectives, it sounds like here on this is, do you trust that one person, and can you trust any one person?
That's
I don't
true.
have a great answer to that.
I don't have a great answer for that. I don't know him. We got to get him on the podcast. I guess we're gonna have to keep cranking that out.
Just call Grimes and see if she can get him.
We will see what happens. I feel personally, it's not my life. I'm not on Twitter that much. I go there if something big happens. I think it's a good thing. But time will tell. And you know what, Ford, we're going to have you back on after. We'll have to do a follow up on this. But I don't want to be respectful of time. We're running a little bit late, but I had a great time. So where can the good people find you? Give us all the links, all the things.
For sure. So my outlet is News to Share. That's news, the number to share. And so on Facebook, it's News to Share. On YouTube, it's News to Share. And I'm at Ford Fischer on Twitter. And I also have a Patreon. So if you are the type of person who would like to support this kind of work, especially if you start following it and you find it valuable, you can sign up for my Patreon and contribute a small amount every month. And that makes a big difference in creating a budget for me to hire people, as well as go out and cover things myself. So thanks for listening, and I hope you check my stuff out.
All right, man. Thank you so much. As always, it's been a pleasure. We've got to get you back on, dude. Thanks so much for doing this. Good people, like and subscribe. Give us a five stars on Apple, and also check out our Clips channel as well, with the best and the best talking pieces from the show, all wrapped up in a nice, smooth, easy to consume video. All right, folks, we'll talk to you next week.